Hello there guys, and welcome back to Nerd Kingdom. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Tomb of Annihilation. Now we're not going to be taking a look at the full Tomb of Annihilation campaign because this contains a ton of information about Chult and adventuring through Chult and all that kind of good stuff. But today we're actually going to be taking a look at the Tomb of Annihilation itself. We're going to be going through the dungeon and I'm going to be giving you my tips and advice on how to run this dungeon as somebody who's run through it themselves. Things that I altered, things that I changed, things that I found to just be more interesting than it was as written. Now, warning here guys, it is going to contain a ton of spoilers about the tomb because I'm not only going to be telling you about the things that I would alter about the dungeon, but I'm also going to be telling you about some of the things that are in the dungeon that I really liked. So there's going to be a few spoilers here. If you are a player who plans to play through this, maybe don't watch this video because it will contain some spoilers. Now, the first thing that I was not aware of is how much of this tomb people tend to know. If you are running for a group that have been playing D&D for a while, there is a fair chance that they are going to know aspects of this tomb and this dungeon. A case in point was the first adventure my players actually got to this dungeon. In Area 1 there is a black obelisk, and destroying this obelisk is going to release a demon. All of my players, apart from maybe two of them, knew about this trap. They knew that if they destroyed this obelisk, then they were going to release this demon into the world. So that is one of the first reasons why I decided to change certain aspects of this tomb, was because other parts of it, not every room, because my players hadn't actually run through or read this dungeon themselves, but certain parts of this are so well known to people in the D&D community that I had to change things to keep it feeling fresh for my players. Now, throughout this tomb, there are a variety of different sarcophaguses hidden in this Tomb of Annihilation. And they're first sort of hinted at in Area 2, where you find these different statues dedicated to the trickster gods of Chult. When your players open up one of these sarcophaguses, they will be basically possessed by one of these trickster gods, giving them some benefits and also some flaws. And the spirits can basically give them some hints and advice and some tips as they go through this dungeon. In some cases, these can be mini power-ups. They can also be interesting roleplay opportunities. However, I decided not to use them. The reason being is my party, as they were entering into this, were an average of 16th level, with some people being 15th and some people being 17th. So I felt like these little power-ups from these trickster spirits weren't really needed. Now, if you plan on using these trickster spirits, then that is great. They offer a great amount of roleplay opportunity and some really interesting benefits and flaws for your characters. But if you feel like I did and decide not to use them, then a great alternative is to have these sarcophaguses containing enemies of Acererak. Now, obviously, these were enemies of Acererak in life. These are people who fought against the Lich and lost. People who impressed him. People who may have gotten to the ends of some of his tombs. Some of these individuals may just be deceased bodies in these sarcophaguses. Others might have been brought back in various stages of undeath. Mummies, vampires, flesh golems and the like. All brought back and basically offer warnings to the party about Acererak. They may offer some history about the Lich, when and how they fought him, or how they defeated him, or how they bested him in some way, and how he came back with a vengeance, showing the party that even if they make it to the end of this tomb, the Lich will still be there to finish them off, will always be this threat and this presence hanging over them, because you don't just simply beat a Lich like Acererak. Now, when your party first approach the Tomb of Annihilation, there is a chance that they will be tricked by the false entrance. This is an entrance that leads to a doorway, and labelled Area 3 is a 10-foot by 10-foot room. As it's written in the adventure, this is a great little poison trap. It has a gas-filled chamber, and anyone who falls prey to it is going to be taking around 22 points of both acid and poison damage. This is a really good way of basically establishing how the group are going to be continuing. This is how the tomb is going to be from here on out. There are going to be traps, there are going to be things around every corner that are going to try and trick you and lead you into a false sense of security, where in reality you are going to be duped. But I decided to make this a little bit more aggressive and a little bit harsher. Now, I'm going to tell you the trap that I used, but I do not recommend using it unless either you want to really establish this as being a very harsh tomb, or your party have some allies. In my situation, the party arrived at the Tomb of Annihilation with an ally with them, and it was an ally that was very much connected with one of the players, somebody who the group felt for and cared about, and who unfortunately was going to be the first victim of this adventure. I altered Area 3 so that when they opened the door, this giant heavy door that the group needed a combined strength of something like 33 to open, when they eventually pulled this door open and they looked into it, they see this giant corridor, this 10-foot wide corridor leading into the darkness. And one character decides to step in first. As soon as that one character enters first, the door slams shut and everyone else is locked out. The illusion of this corridor leading into the dungeon is dropped, and they can see that they are trapped in a 10-foot by 10-foot room. All of a sudden, shadows start appearing around them, and it is made very clear that they are about to die. But they hear the voice of a Serac in their head, a voice that offers them a way out. The way out being, all they have to do is name somebody to take their place. Obviously, any player is going to be naming the NPC. The one NPC character that might be with them, one of the NPC characters that are with them. And their positions are swapped. Now, the purpose of this trap isn't to kill a player. That's why I don't recommend using it unless you have an NPC with you. But this is going to be an instant kill trap. The party member that is trapped in there might not decide to name anybody, not wanting to doom another party member, in which case their character is taken from them and they are unfortunately killed. This is a possibility, but I don't think this is a likely option. What this trap is designed to do, it's designed to get rid of any NPCs that are with your group. It's designed to basically trade one life for another. What this does is it creates a rift in the party, and a group that are emotionally split are less likely to save each other. When one party member is in desperate need of help, all of a sudden they think back to that moment when one party member traded their lives of their companions for their own. So generally speaking, the first floor of the Tomb of Annihilation is really cool. I mean, reading through the entire thing, it's fantastic. You have some really interesting passageways in some places. There are some secret doors and entrances and a variety of ways to get to lower levels. There are some fantastic traps in Area 8, which is going to destroy metallic items that the party are holding and gathering. Area 15 has this giant spinning bladed fan, which is just going to mess some party members up and really ruin some people's health if they fail some saves. And also Area 16 contains a really interesting little puzzle that they have to try and work out that I really enjoyed, although the description of it I felt was a little bit complicated. The only thing I had, which was an issue with this level of the dungeon, was of course Area 10. Area 10 contains something like 6 wights, which are a challenge rating 3 creature, but also aren't that big of a threat. I mean, the group at this point are expected to be something like, I don't know, like 11th to 13th level, around that number, and my group were even higher again. So having something like 6 wights in a room just was not useful or interesting or challenging in any way. What I recommend instead is to replace those wights with the infinitely cooler and way more impressive Tomb Guardians. Those guys are brilliant. On the topic of Area 10, this is also where the first sarcophagus is contained, and I said earlier about how I'd tweak the sarcophaguses to include some spirits, so I'll give you an example of the one that I used here. In Area 6, we get a description of a crystalline mirror, and I had this basically obscuring the form of whoever was on the other side. And as the party look down the corridor to the left towards Area 6 and towards room number 10, towards this mirror they see a humanoid figure apparently waving. And they decided immediately, hell no, we're not going near that thing, that looks terrifying, and they promptly went the other way. Eventually, though, the group circled back round and they managed to find the secret entrance to the north. One of the characters opened this secret entrance next to one of these chairs and looked into the room, and they got a different angle, they got a different perspective. They could see what appeared to be a flesh golem woman looking at her own reflection. She was wearing a wedding dress, a tattered old wedding dress, looking at her own reflection, and the apparent waving that they saw through this crystalline mirror was actually her caressing her own face in the reflection, as if looking back and thinking about a time long past. This is one of the people who has thwarted a Sararak in his past, somebody who he wishes now to suffer in death. The tomb guardians that are within this room are there to make sure she does not attempt to leave, and she is just waiting for somebody or something to try and help her and to free her, knowing that she can never return to the life that she once had, knowing that everyone she has probably known is long dead. So that gives you one example of how I went around changing the tombs and the sarcophagus' purposes. I just decided that would be a more interesting roleplay encounter and would work better for my group, but I hope it gives you some ideas if you want to do the same sort of thing. Level 2 is known as the Dungeon of Deception, and again contains some really interesting rooms, some interesting places for the characters to discover. By far the most interesting of this is the Area 22, which contains basically some ever-spawning skeletons, and is absolutely terrifying for the party to encounter. There are some traps, there are some really interesting statues here, there's a great puzzle and a great conclusion to it. It is by far my favourite room. I did decide to add a skull lord to this because, again, I wanted there to be some sort of notable NPC style creature there who was pretty interesting and who the characters kind of interact with. So there was a skull lord within this tomb as well, constantly spawning skeletons to those who did not worship the faceless statue in the room. But this was a fantastic encounter. Now, there is another notable NPC within this dungeon in Area 28, and that is Withers. Withers is a wight, he is named, he has a bunch of, crawling hands around him. He's an interesting kind of character, but he's not really a threat to the party. Now, Withers will be mentioned in a couple of different levels as somebody who is going to constantly try to screw over the party, but I felt like that was such a waste of the character, because if the characters actually meet Withers in person, he's no threat to a group of high-level adventurers. He's just a wight. So I decided to make Withers a roleplay encounter, and I highly recommend you do the same. The roleplay that I recommend is that Withers is willing to bargain a second chance at life should the adventurers fall in this dungeon. He is willing to play some sort of game, whether it be a card game or a game of skill or a game of chance, some sort of game with the party members. Should they win, he promises that if they die within the dungeon, they will be brought back to life, spawning outside the tomb next to the obelisk. If they lose, he takes one of their hands to join his collection. I think this is a really interesting opportunity because it means that if the party die within this tomb, they kind of have a second chance. And really in this adventure, there's kind of no second chances, so this is a great opportunity for them if they want to take it. In my situation, though, the party really did not trust Withers and decided to just leave the situation as it was, in which case Withers will continue to act against them in secret and hidden ways that they aren't aware of. But either way, this is an interesting roleplay encounter to have pop up in this tomb. My final tweak for this level 2 section of the dungeon is something that actually my players suggested and really wanted to occur, and that was in level 20. There are these brilliant fonts. There's a sarcophagus there. There are these fantastic fonts that have wine and traces of wine on them. It's this beautiful marbled tile, this vaulted ceiling, this ray of light shining down, and my players were convinced that there was a vampire in here. They were, in fact, certain that there was a vampire in here, so certain that they decided to leave the room without fully discovering it for themselves. And when I had eventually turned around and told them, no guys, unfortunately there's no vampire in this section of the dungeon, they turned around and were like, well, there needs to be. There should definitely be a vampire encounter there because that would have been fantastic. So throw a vampire into that tomb as well. Weirdly, level 3 of the Tomb of Annihilation is one of my favourite levels of the dungeon and one of my least favourites. Now, it has one of my favourite encounters in the entirety of this dungeon in 44B. You have this really clean, smooth, varnished floor, this super slippery floor. There's this giant floating orb covered in a cloth, which is actually, when the cloth is removed, is a giant magnetic ball that sucks any characters with metal straight up and sticks them to this ball. And hidden in 44B is an invisible beholder. So this thing is invisible, blocking spells with its eyes and just shooting eye rays left, right, and center when half the party are stuck to this ball, unable to move. It is a absolute mayhem. It's so well designed. It's such a great encounter. And I think everyone who goes into this tomb should experience it or should be aware that it's there. It's fantastic. But here's the issue. You need to go and collect 10 of these small, like, orb beholder eye things in order to unlock this room, in order to get into this room. That means that your players would have had to, in order to get into this locked room, they would have had to find 9 cubes in order to gain access to the Tomb of Annihilation. In order to get to the Soulmonger, they need to find 5 skeleton keys, which are literally skeletons with keys, that are hidden throughout this tomb. And now, to find this beholder, which is a really cool, well-designed encounter, they need to find 10 orbs hidden around this level. In my opinion, there's just too much searching and hunting for different objects. It's really boring by this point, as a DM running it and as a player experiencing it. Now, I don't really know many ways of improving this layer of the dungeon. What I kind of think would be really cool is this moss, this purple moss that's everywhere, can, if attacked, grow eye stalks and start shooting players with eye stalks. I think having a skeleton key running through this dungeon, heading in different directions and basically activating a bunch of different traps in order to escape the players would be really interesting, all the while having these eye stalks popping up from this purple moss and shooting players. I think that would be really, really fun and really interesting. But again, this would require a lot of work from a DM to sort of plan the route they would run and basically adapt in a chase scene style way for your players. Generally, though, another option you could do is to just maybe have a bunch of interesting treasures and loot dotted around this instead of having these eye-like objects. A couple of mundane magical items or some just interesting things that your players might need, like a ring of protection over here or cloak of protection, something like that. Maybe some scrolls or some potions, and then offer an alternative way of accessing the beholder's room. That way the players get to experience a lot of the traps and puzzles that are genuinely quite interesting, but they can leave them if they want to and they don't have to bother with them. And they also get to experience the beholder's room if they can just outsmart a simple trick or a simple puzzle or opportunity. Just a quick note about level 3 as well, is that it contains a really interesting and really horrifying trap, which is in area 32. It's like a corkscrew trap, which basically is going to trap one or more players on the bottom level of this corkscrew trap. This could quite easily result in one or more players being permanently trapped if they haven't got the right gear or equipment, and as a result I would be really cautious with it, because if your players go down this tunnel, then they could genuinely end up losing their character from not doing anything wrong, just exploring more of this dungeon. So be warned, but it is a really interesting and good trap. One way in which I recommend basically having your players feel really cautious and nervous about tunnels is by having them not be able to continue through them if they're wearing certain types of armor, right? Like heavy armor, for example, and medium armor is quite sturdy, it's rigid. So if they try going through those tunnels, then there's a chance that they could get stuck unless they remove those pieces of armor. Same with certain weapons and items, things like bastard swords and staffs and things like that. These generally quite heavy, long, difficult to conceal and difficult to just hold on your person weapons and pieces of equipment. They would need to remove, otherwise there's a chance they could get stuck in one of these tunnels. And yes, you can have party members help them get out of the tunnel, but it would just mean that when they are going through these tunnel systems, they're a lot more cautious to use them because they don't have all their gear. So, Area 4, Level 4 of the dungeon is absolutely fantastic. It's known as the Chambers of Horror, and it really fits that name brilliantly. Now, there are some interesting parts about this dungeon, and there are some parts on it that I think are don't really work, but those are very few. The one thing that I don't think worked with this, and my players didn't think worked with this whole section of the dungeon, is Area 47, which is basically these 4 rooms with an anti-magic field in them, which basically have the weirdest conclusion to their traps. So Area 47, for example, one of the rooms is going to fill with water. It's an anti-magic field, so you can't use spells or abilities. It's going to fill with water and the players are going to drown. The only way of solving this and the way of getting to breathe again is to basically pick an oyster or other sea creature off the wall and to eat it. My players hated this because it just made no sense to them. They didn't understand it. There was nothing hinting at the solution to this puzzle. Now, as a DM, I quite enjoyed this trap, but my players loathed it. I enjoyed it because, to me, why would you know a solution? Why would there be a clue about the solution on the walls? Why would you have any hints? But to the party, they think this is unfair, they don't like it, and I totally get that as well. It's not a fun puzzle, so maybe think about incorporating something a little bit different in there. Another room in this section, I mean, this entire floor is absolute gold, but another really interesting one is 52. 52 is kind of a Serak's throne room. And in his throne room, there are going to be paintings and artists painting basically the party's adventure through the dungeon so far. It means that they're constantly being watched. I had an apparition of a Serak turn up here and talk to the party and basically mock them about people who had died so far and about things that they'd failed at and things that they'd missed in the dungeon. And they really loathed that. They really didn't like that. That made a few of them very nervous. But it was a really great roleplay situation. There's also Area 57 within this section of the dungeon as well. Area 57 is a really interesting portion of this dungeon where your party are going to end up if they try teleporting. So that is definitely worth having a read before you start running this dungeon, because you may want to know that could come up at any point. Your party could decide to try and teleport at any point. So knowing that is really useful. The last room I want to talk about at this section of the dungeon, of course, is Area 49. Area 49 is where you're going to find the Black Opal Crown. Now, the Black Opal Crown is one of those magical items that just doesn't have a stat block. It's like left to the DM's conclusions. Now, there is a stat block that you can find for it online. I'll post a link to that website so you can see, and it has a couple of items in the dungeon that you might find, and it gives some stats for it. And I'm going to basically say right now, and it's commented all across the internet about the Black Opal Crown, that if you actually allow your players to get a hold of the Black Opal Crown, it will destroy your game. It will completely off-balance everything. It will ruin your game entirely, and as a result, be really careful with it. Basically, it allows your players to just destroy everything with just touching it. Like, if they can touch something, if they can hit it with an attack, melee attack, it's just destroyed. So what I recommend is any character who attunes or puts on the Black Opal Crown is immediately lost. Like, they put the crown on and that character is just lost, and they bamf and they teleport away and they're gone. They're an enemy for another day. They are a DM related threat. That character is gone. Simply because if you allow your players to use this crown, and bear in mind, I think that the stats provided for this are genuinely pretty interesting and pretty cool. I don't think they're ridiculous. But if you allow your players to use even a weakened version of this crown, it can destroy your campaign. So I highly recommend you just don't allow your players to use it, because it's so powerful. If you do decide to allow your players to use the Black Opal Crown, then be incredibly careful. Maybe have requirements, maybe have the crown not work for certain players. It's only going to work for players who are using its power to accomplish its goals, and that way you kind of have a story-related reason to allowing it to work. I'll leave it to you guys, but it's a really interesting item, so just be aware that it's within this tomb. Level 5 of the dungeon is known as the Gears of Hate, and I thought that this was a really bizarre but also kind of an interesting part of the dungeon. This is probably the section of the dungeon my players spent the most time, and as a result, I have a lot of different opinions on it. I have mixed opinions, mainly because of how odd this dungeon was to run. This is a super difficult dungeon to map and to allow your players to have free reign on. So hidden in this watery section of the dungeon is an Aboleth, but an Aboleth for a higher level party is really difficult to face, so I ended up using a lot of homebrew rules and stuff like that to incorporate sanity into the game. So basically my players ended up starting to go mental when they were around this area of the dungeon, and that was a lot of fun to roleplay those interactions. And I recommend you kind of do something similar, because if your party is higher than 10th level and they're facing off against an Aboleth really isn't going to be that much of a threat unless you are using some very strict underwater combat fighting rules and things like that. So just be a bit cautious with that kind of thing. Now, there are a few traps and few interesting things going on in this dungeon. There are some control panels and some various opportunities and ways that the characters can get around. There is quite a lot of fighting in areas 60 and 67 of this dungeon. A lot of fighting that I actually really didn't like. It was almost like there was just too much combat, almost like waves of combat happening. And I felt like I wanted to just sort of like reduce that by quite a bit. So just be aware that if your characters are deciding to explore this entire level of the dungeon, they may be fighting an Aboleth, they may be fighting a horde of demons, and they may be fighting some other creatures there as well. So it's quite a dangerous dungeon, especially considering that this is the last but one layers of the dungeon, and there are some other things down below that I think should be the harder fights. So I don't think in this situation that quantity really equals quality. As well as that, as I said, this is quite a difficult dungeon to map out. I was using Roll20 when running this game because, of course, we've been going through some stuff recently, haven't we? So what I've been dealing with is Roll20, and Roll20 doesn't allow you to actually rotate or to move around these sections of the dungeon, to my knowledge. So we've just been running through this and using a lot of Theatre of the Mind stuff with this section of the dungeon and trying to map it out as best we can. And generally this can be quite a difficult section of the dungeon to run, so just be aware that there are a lot of map issues. It's a weird dungeon to try and describe to your players and to convey a lot of the sort of how it looks. One really interesting part of the dungeon that I wanted to mention to you, well, two really interesting parts of the dungeon I wanted to mention to you are Area 68, which is similar to Area 8 of the dungeon. Instead, it works against fabric. So items such as like cloaks, leather, cloth, that kind of thing, it's just going to start destroying those within Area 68, which is really interesting because you need to move through there in order to get to the lower levels, to get to level 6 of the dungeon. And also Area 70, which is this giant, weird, oscillating orb-like structure. That can be a really interesting opportunity to allow your players to access some new abilities or access some new effects. I mean, it's called the Armillary Sphere conjunction. I thought that this was a really interesting sphere, and you can add a bunch of homebrew effects to this, kind of like a wild magic table of different effects that could activate. But I thought this was really cool if your players are in desperate need of a power-up or really in desperate need of some sort of ability boost, then this is a really great inbuilt way of allowing that to happen. So some really great content in here. It's also a really great way of offering another trap idea for your players if they jump in and start messing around with it. So I really like this sphere. And just like that, we are on level 6 of the dungeon, and this is the Cradle of the Death God. This is where your characters will find the skeleton gate to unlock it and to finally face off against the Atropotal and the Soulmonger. Now, guarding this gate are 3 Crones, which basically work for a Serac and basically help to nurse this death god into adulthood. But I decided that these Crones were quite weak. They were 3 night tags, and I decided they didn't really offer the same sort of challenge as I wanted. And same with the Atropal. They weren't really threatening creatures, in my opinion. They were just slightly on the weaker side. So I decided to incorporate, and I'll put a link in the description for this, the Book of Beautiful Horrors. And I decided to use the Crone stat block, which have a bunch of different varieties of witches with a bunch of different effects. Really powerful. Challenge rate in 15 creatures that are just absolutely wonderful. So I decided to use those instead of the night tags, and to just then run the Atropal encounter as it is written, because I thought that would be a nice conclusion. Now, because I had upped the level of the witches, I decided a Serac wouldn't then turn up at the end and fight for 100 hit points as is suggested in the book. I decided instead he would turn up as an aspect, completely unkillable, completely undamageable, and basically say to the adventurers that they have basically thwarted his plans in this dungeon, and that they are very aware of what he does to people who thwart his plans at this point, and that they will be seeing him again very soon, basically making him again this additional threat within the world. They have thwarted the powers of this incredibly strong lich, and now they are on his radar. So that is a that is how I basically concluded this adventure. Now, I recommend, if your party is quite a high level at this point, or you guys have a group of players with a lot of magical items, they haven't taken much damage, maybe they've been really cautious about progressing through this tomb, then I recommend using the Book of Beautiful Horrors, and I recommend using the Crones stat block. That will be a pretty challenging fight for any party to go through, but be careful, because these Crones, they do have some abilities, so you may want to limit the amount of abilities these Crones have, maybe limit the amount of HP they have, or their armor class or something, just to kind of tweak this and make it more in the party's ballpark. But they are a fantastically versatile enemy to use, and I thought, why not use them, because they're just so well made. Well guys, that really concludes this how to run video talking about the Tomb of Annihilation. Thank you so much for watching. I've really appreciated it. Stay tuned for more videos, and I'll see you again next time.